Green to Scale project, why we launched this project in the first place, we had a very simple question in mind, which was how far could the world go simply using what we already know and what we already have? How much could we reduce emissions by simply scaling up the solutions that already are there and have been put into place in at least some countries? And we also wanted to have perhaps an even more specific approach, which was to limit ourselves to scaling up these solutions by 2030 in other countries, only to the extent that some countries have already done today. So basically, these solutions must be very much realistic if some countries have already implemented them, and then we just wanted to know what we could do if other countries followed and catched up. Now, we did a similar exercise already a little more than a year ago, looking at 17 global or international solutions from various different countries, from China, the United States, or Germany, Japan. And what we found out was very inspiring. Scaling up these 17 existing solutions to other countries could deliver emission reductions that would equal about a quarter of world's emissions today. So we are talking about very significant emission reductions simply using existing solutions and only applying them to the extent that some countries have already done by today. And that was not the only thing we found. We also realized that scaling up these solutions is much more affordable than many people tend to think. We found out that the cost at most, using the most pessimistic assumptions of scaling up these 17 solutions, would be around perhaps 1/5 of how much the world uses in direct fossil fuel subsidies today. So clearly that must be affordable. If we can afford to spend huge amounts on fossil fuel subsidies, we should be able to afford to divert a fraction of those subsidies to finance these low carbon solutions. Now, what we did this time was to focus on Nordic low carbon solutions. We looked at 15 solutions from 5 different Nordic countries. And Eva already, no, it was actually Leif who said what the institutions that were involved in this project were. In Sweden, we would, of course, very much like to thank Stockholm Environment Institute, obviously one of the most prestigious, well-known institutions in this field, not only in Nordic countries, but internationally. And of course, the Nordic Council of Ministers for kindly providing the funding to make this project happen. 15 Nordic solutions. What did we find out by analyzing those? Well, we found out that by scaling up these 15 solutions to comparable countries in other parts of the world, we could cut global emissions by about 4 gigatons. And for those of you who don't work with gigatons and megatons on a daily basis, that is basically equal to the combined annual emissions of the whole European Union today. So very significant emission reductions, simply using a fraction of the solutions we know today. We looked at solutions from 5 different sectors, from energy, industry, transport, buildings and households, and agriculture and forests. And as you can see in this graph here, energy sector, at least in this case and in this study, seems to deliver the largest emission reductions. But we also have solutions for all other key sectors, all other key contributors of emissions. So the solutions are very varied and they are available for basically all important sectors. Again, I think what strikes me most as a former policymaker is how affordable these solutions actually are. Remember, we could cut emissions by as much as the whole European Union produces. And we could do that at the cost of just 9 days of fossil fuel subsidy spending today. Clearly, we can afford that. It's not a question of money as much as it is about policy, as it is about leadership, as it is about vision. And these figures about the costs of excuse me, scaling up these solutions do not take into account the various co-benefits these solutions can provide to people and the environment. We know, for instance, that whenever we cut fossil fuel use, we usually also at the same time can cut harmful air pollutants. And when we cut those air pollutants, it means that people are healthier, and it means that we have to pay less for healthcare costs. None of these benefits are included in the cost figures we presented. So if those were actually factored in, these solutions would become even more affordable and attractive, even on a financial basis. I mentioned that we looked at 15 solutions from 5 different sectors. And now you can also see that some of these solutions tend to be quite a bit more promising in terms of reducing emissions than some others. In particular, in our study and using the approach we chose for the study, combined heat and power production seems to be very promising. And I was advised that I should say that it's kraftvärme in Swedish in case this English term is not so commonly used. But there are also many other solutions that seem to be delivering quite large emission reductions. Onshore wind power, manure management, biofuels in transport, energy efficiency in buildings, and some others. I think what might catch your attention is that you also have quite a lot of solutions that don't seem to deliver very large emission reductions at all. And some of them might actually be quite surprising, because you've been reading news stories, you've been reading headlines about, let's say, electric vehicles or offshore wind or heat pumps in the case of Sweden. Why do they not seem so promising at all in this study? I'm going to come back to that. You might want to know that we looked at 5 different Swedish cases for these 15 solutions. Offshore wind, no, sorry, that should be onshore wind, I'm on the wrong line. Onshore wind, low carbon energy in industry, biofuels in transport, energy efficiency in buildings, and residential heat pumps, obviously Sweden being well known for that. You also see some other flags there. We wanted to be very Nordic, so some of these solutions we actually did not limit ourselves only looking at the case of Sweden, but actually compared different Nordic countries. So, for instance, onshore wind, obviously everyone knows that Denmark is another Nordic country that has been doing tremendously well in investing in wind. And biofuels in transport, Sweden, a very good job. Finland, pretty good job as well. So we wanted to look at these different cases for our study. Now, why do the potentials for some of these solutions seem so small? It is a direct result of the methodology and the approach we chose. Just to remind you that we only scale up these solutions to comparable countries. And what comparable countries means is, of course, different from one solution to another. For instance, when we looked at using biomass for energy production, we wanted to look at countries that have large enough sustainable biomass resources. So we actually ended up scaling up the solution only to 3 countries out of God knows how many, 200 countries in the world. And of course, that limits the potential. If you actually extended the solution to a larger number of countries, you would get larger emission reductions as well. We only looked at the potential if other countries caught up with Nordic countries and the level Nordic countries have achieved today. But we of course know that the Nordic countries and other countries are not going to stop at where we are today. They're going to go further, and they will need to go further in implementing many of these solutions. So the potential is going to be larger than the one we identified. And we also wanted to make sure that what we study is only on top, the kind of added value compared with what is going to happen anyway. So we only looked at the potential on top of a baseline scenario, as people say when they make scenarios. To make this a bit more concrete, let's look at one concrete case. That is the electric vehicles. For electric vehicles, we looked at how Norway has been able to introduce very large numbers of electric vehicles in a very short time. And the potential is quite small, as you saw in the previous graphs. But we only looked at private cars. If we included also vans, if we included buses, trucks perhaps, then the potential of course would be larger. So that's one factor limiting the potential in this particular case. Electric vehicles are still fairly expensive. The prices are going to come down. They have already come down. But if you today wanted to buy an electric vehicle, that's not really a solution that is easily approachable for many poorer countries. So we limited the application of electric vehicles only to wealthy countries. In the future, we know that many emerging economies will also start using electric vehicles, and that will make the potential larger than the one we identified in our study. Electric vehicles obviously use electricity, and the emission reduction potential is dependent on how that electricity is produced. In the future, countries will have to decarbonize their electricity production, and as they do that, the potential of using electric vehicles for reducing emissions grows at the same time. And finally, while Norway has been tremendously successful in introducing electric vehicles, I think the most recent data we used for our study was that 1 in 4 new sold cars in Norway is either a full electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid. Tremendous success. But countries can and countries will have to go further than that. By 2030, we will see Norway and probably many other countries achieving even higher penetrations of electric vehicles. And again, the full potential will be larger thanks to that. I said that these solutions are surprisingly affordable. However, I should note that there is quite a lot of variability between these different solutions and their prices. Some of these solutions seem to come with a price tag. You have to pay a little extra to implement these solutions. In our study, the biggest cost would come from implementing onshore wind. Why that is the case is a bit longer story. We can come back to that a bit later if you want. But then on the other hand, you have all these solutions that would actually save money. So you reduce emissions and at the same time you actually get more money back. And what is common to most of these money-saving solutions is that they are also energy-saving solutions at the same time. When you improve energy efficiency, you need less energy, you have to pay less for your energy, and then of course you get savings. And putting all these costs together, the cost and the savings, that is how we came up with the total net figure for implementing all these solutions. And now, I think it was Eva who referred to the barriers before. If these solutions are indeed so promising, attractive, affordable, why are they not being implemented at larger scale already? And the reason is barriers. There are various barriers slowing down the deployment of these solutions. And the barriers, they are of course different from one solution to another and from one country to another. But some of these barriers are quite common to many countries and many solutions. For instance, many of these solutions do require a fairly large upfront investment. If you build a wind power project, you'll first have to, well, quite literally build the wind power plants. And you have to pay for that cost immediately. You will get savings over time because they will be producing electricity for another 30, 40 years. And the fuel, wind, is free, so you save money. But you'll have to pay first to get those wind power plants built. And not all countries have that type of capital available to invest in those projects. If you go to poorer countries in Africa, they might be very much interested in wind power and other renewable energy sources, but they don't necessarily have the financing to do that. Another fairly common barrier is simply lack of awareness. If you, and I'm a policymaker, or used to be a policymaker myself, if you go and talk to policymakers, they don't always have the most up-to-date information about the potential and promise of these different solutions. If you look at how the price of solar power has plummeted in the past 5 years, or if you look at how wind power has been getting cheaper and cheaper essentially every year, if you look at the declining costs of batteries for energy storage and electric vehicles, if you have only 3 or 5 years old data at your disposal and you make policy decisions based on that old, outdated data, you're going to come to very different conclusions. And that is why we are spreading this information about these solutions. That is why we are organizing these events, and that is why we came up with this report. We want to help policymakers, decision makers everywhere to use more up-to-date information and to fully realize how promising these solutions actually are. The good news is that we can remove these barriers, and we know that simply because some countries have already done that. The 15 cases we look at in our study prove that there are various ways to remove these barriers. I think the most commonly quoted solution or tool at every single climate seminar I've ever attended is probably pricing carbon. And that is really key, to introduce the right incentives to make these low carbon investments and to use these low carbon solutions. In Nordic countries, we operate under the EU emissions trading system. We have been forerunners internationally in introducing different carbon taxes. But if you look at the levels of, let's say, the emission allowances on the EU emissions trading market today, it's quite obvious that the incentive to reduce emissions is not strong enough yet. So we need to make those incentives stronger. And there are, of course, many other tools, and you can read more about those in the report. Now, to conclude, this report and the previous report we released about 1 year ago do show that we have a wide range of existing proven low carbon solutions available for different types of countries and for different sectors. Scaling up these solutions would cut global emissions significantly, taking us very much closer to bridging the emissions gap that we need to do to meet the targets set in the Paris Agreement. These solutions would be, I would say, surprisingly affordable, and they would deliver many co-benefits to people and the environment. So they make a whole lot of sense. We have various barriers that make it more difficult to introduce these solutions, but these barriers can be removed if we learn from the successes of countries that have already done so, and if we learn from each other, like I think Leif said earlier. And that, I think, is one very promising part of Nordic cooperation. We can learn from each other. I would like to end here, but leave you with 2 questions you can perhaps think about. The first question is, what can a country like Sweden do to make sure that these and other existing low carbon solutions are scaled up internationally to as many countries as possible and as fast as possible? And the second question is, do you think there is something Sweden can learn from other Nordic countries and other countries internationally when trying to figure out how to reduce emissions domestically here? Is there something you could learn from other countries? And that's where I would like to end. Thank you very much.